Okay, I think maybe we can start. So my name is Konrad. Hi everyone. I'm working as a senior software architect at Capgemini, and I have quite a lot of experience professionally, more than 70 years. And log is pretty interesting topic, which I can say discovered some time ago. And I just want to share with you my experience. And I think I can, in most extreme case, stop here on this slide because usually people don't read log as a feature. And if you do that, you probably are good. But if you want to dig deeper into the topic, I have a presentation for you. So let's move on and get into the details. So what was the inspiration for this topic? I attended .NET Dev Days 2 years ago, and it was surprising to me that no one is talking diagnostics. There was a lot of improvements discussed technically, and like every conference, a lot of novelties is presented and so on. But to me, nothing like that could be applied without having the knowledge what's wrong, what's going on in your system. So I felt this is the niche and very neglected topic that might be handled one day. So it took a long time for me because you can quickly find a lot of good log practices quickly, but can you memorize all this? Well, I've been fighting with legacy system to make it work for many months, and primarily we've been finding out with the team what are the good diagnostics for that. And the thing that I would find in the internet on the first few Google search results wouldn't help with that. So what I want to propose today is two related concepts instead. They have a lot of details. They will be backed up with the advices that you can call good practices. But the concept I would like to ask you to use every time, and the advice is something I would like to consider. Obviously, they will not always apply because sometimes there might be a different use case for you. Okay, we will mostly discuss backend and what it means to have a feedback from how the application runs there. But all the concepts can be extended, I think, to other types of applications. But this is where my experience primarily comes from. And also, one thing to note here is that I'm not gonna talk technical solution, how to write a file with the log or stuff like that. I want to discuss the contents. The contents is what's interesting to me and what you can do with this. Although I can encourage you to provide your wrapper, your interface for logging. Maybe your framework does it for you. If not, you can do your own abstraction here. And I would like to encourage you to use aggregation tooling. I've been working with Splunk, and everything that I'm going to say today will be compatible with the tooling for logs. Also, I will not discuss aspect approach. This is to make your code cleaner, but it's a pretty useful tool, so just remember that. The primary thing is this, that logs are being used. You do not do logging because just for the sake of it. And as a long-time user, I will try to tell you what's useful and how to approach that. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them in chat, and I will try to answer them at the end. But you can type it during the presentation, obviously. Okay, so why log is attractive? Okay, let's start with that, because what's the point, right? So this is an example log, an excerpt of the log, where you can see at the beginning with these highlighted red entries that application started. This is pretty important. And for me, this is pretty relevant to show what are the circumstances with which that were when application started. In this case, we see that there was some disk space available. You see what the version is, and so on and so on. This is pretty important. You also see stuff that can be used by support and can be hooked into the active monitoring systems. You can see that there is an error upon receiving some request in the system. So what we have from this is user activity, and this everything is evidenced here, and we have quite extensive information attached. If you remove the log and just look at what's on the bottom of the screen, these are pretty nice features. Okay, so let's dig into a single use case and how it can be logged. So here it's just a single request in the system and every log related to it. An example, in my opinion, of quite good log. Why is that considered a good log, in my opinion? I will try to explain in the presentation and how to get into such state. So on the green highlight, we see beginning and the end of the request. So we have beginning till the end documented what we did in the system with the timestamps, which documents time characteristics of every operation. We see middle steps documented, whereas SQL query executed, we have some stats on that. We see another system being called and then the formatting of the results. And we see that we ended our own work. So what it gives us, these are detailed usage stats and how we use other systems. Also, we have, whether you like it or not, performance measurements. And these performance measurements are there because of these timestamps. The timestamps I would consider kind of a metadata to log entry. And there might be like even 30 or 50 other metadata attached to every log entry, for example, in the cloud environments. And what this allows us to do is answer performance questions. We can identify that the service is not working thanks to that, and we can see usual behavior patterns in such log. Also, we have documented production environment and usage, something that you might not have upfront when you design, implement, and design your system. You might not know this, and then you have this feedback from production. So usage stats, performance, debugging, supportability, etc. We can find much more. And why is this important? These are big features that you can have from the logs, which are just some entries that you can make, and they are cheap. So that's why I think it's important to handle them well, because they will pay off. And sometimes your client might not be asking for this, but you might have all these things in place. And by following the concepts I'm going to propose, maybe taking into account a few advices, we can make the look like the example I just showed. So what's important to me is to treat the log as a feature. So alongside other features, you should specify what should go into the log specifically, because you will know what you're gonna do with that, how you can benefit from this, like performance stats specifically, more detailed, or is the maybe a few hours spent on adding few entries there, and you might benefit greatly with analysis later on. Okay, so what should we write into the log? Okay, let's go by example, and we will see how we can extend the logging. If it's poor, for example, maybe you can come across your legacy system that you work on, and it's pretty bad shape already. Yeah, and usually people ask about why my request came in and it's slow, and here you can see nothing in the log. This is pretty bad shape here. By analyzing the timestamps, you can notice that one of the requests was pretty quick, and the other request took like 12 seconds. These are requests that ask for the same resource, you can say in a REST service. and you cannot distinguish them. You cannot say anything about it. So first extension that you can do is to provide stats summary of what you did to handle the request, like the size of the response, like whether you used cache or not, these kind of flags, whatever is relevant in your system. The other thing is that you log the total duration. The total duration should be measured independently on some internal steps, and then you can log also the internal steps. Like here, we can see one of the requests probably took more time because it was read from the database, and the short request was from cache. But you have this information and the breakdown of the steps independently measured. You can say which user did what request, if you can identify users doing the request. And this still doesn't really solve the puzzle here. The final thing to answer this is to link together the entries at the beginning when the resource came in and when it got back to the user, and that can really correlate these entries. And this is the first concept that we're going to discuss. But first, let's take the advisors out of the picture, which maybe not always are applicable, but it's a good thing to do. Log the duration and each processing step duration breakdown, so you can find out the bottlenecks. And another advice is log as much as you can. As you could see, we did extend the logging with adding more and more information. So on the internet, there will be a lot of advice. So you should be maybe brief with the logs or not, and so on. I'd say log as much as you can. And for HTTP stuff, specifically, for example, it might be these things. And even more, you can find out so many things you can put there that I wouldn't be able to list them all. But we added this connection between log entries, and that's our correlation concept. This is just the definition of what correlation is, but in our context, it should link the logs. It's not just two logs, but a lot of them in the middle. And in the this request example that I gave at the beginning, everything was correlated. So it has two forms. Coincidental correlation, where you already have it because you probably use something like, you process something, you have some identifiers in the systems, data on your entities, and that may bring you the information that something is relating to this piece of data. This is coincidental because it's not intended usage. This is not something that you do on purpose. And this is the second form of correlation, where you explicitly add a made-up ID. And as in this example, this has this primary benefit where someone is asking for the same business thing twice. You can distinguish these requests by adding your explicit correlation. So I'd say concept number one is log should always be correlated, and it's unspecified with what and how. So we show many examples of correlation and how it should be applied. Okay, but correlation will not solve everything by itself. That's why we have two concepts. And the second one is for the same problem reported, but in a bit different form, where one of the requests took 45 minutes. So the log might look like this, and on the right side, you can see that is correlated, have these unique IDs. So there's already two requests happening really, but it doesn't really give you the full picture. You see some following entries after the first request, but it doesn't really tell you everything because you don't have this beginning and the end steps documented. And this is primarily important here, that if you start some activity and you go somewhere outside of your system, for example, and you get back, you should document, evidence that. Same goes to not just these steps in the middle. It's good that it's there, but also the entire process. So you did receive the request and you send the results. So we finish your work and you evidence that. So based on the timestamps here, we might conclude, that the difference in time between the request number one and number two is indeed 45 minutes or so. But what happened? Maybe user went for the coffee, they pressed the button to see the first results, but they forgot about it, closed the browser. Whatever happened, but you know that your backend was working well. And it's pretty big. And I call it in and out rule. So when you get into the scope and going out of the scope, you should evidence two events like this. I will show that an example in a moment because there's quite a bit of details here. And the other way you can call it is that the logs should go in pairs every time you want to log something. There are exceptions to this, which I'm also going to cover, but yeah, whichever makes more resonance to you, I will use interchangeably in and out and going in pairs concept names. Okay, so let's apply that in practice. So I will follow up where to apply this in and out rule. So when you have more than one process and you need to go somewhere and you need to lose the control from your existing process, like with these examples, you do the database query. So you send a SQL and you want to get the results. So you should evidence the fact. It's a very simplistic code. In the end, it's not gonna look so simple, but it's just to show what's the idea. Other things might also be influenced by such approach. So system API, the system is doing something for you. Another service, you wait for user input. You do some long file operations. All these examples just to show the idea. Ideally, you should correlate these entries so you know what are you talking about. And what's the difference and why we do that? If the log goes to a single file because you have just a single instance of your application on a single server in production, that's great. It's very simple, and that is enough. That's correlated because you know where it runs and what it is and so on. But if you have distributed environment, multi-service one, where there are multiple instances going on, this is very helpful because your log that you read or maybe have it aggregated might have these entries mixed a lot. Then you can link together the entries that you're interested in. Okay, going on. Reverse situation. We have incoming request to your system. So your controller can get something and you want to evidence that you finished the work. Or maybe that comes from some scheduling or some message queue, not necessarily just from like REST requests and so on. Or maybe you do a desktop application that just receives user input and so on. So wherever you wait and you finish doing something based on some event, that's also something you should evidence and ideally correlate. Okay. Okay, moving on. When you have two services communicating, and maybe that's very obvious, but I've seen my senior programmers in my team neglecting this. Is we have a conversation between two services in your system, log perspective on both ends, because you never know when or from which service you're gonna start the investigations or you wanna check something. Your front end is also your different service, different user, and you definitely want to communicate everything that goes on with your front end to your back end. So maybe that's obvious, but again, I have to explain this many times. Another thing where you should apply this rule that you change the scope is when you change the logical scope in your application. So let's say you have a big calculation going on, multi-step. You might evidence that you went through step 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this is pretty useful. How deep you should go, I would say, decide with your team. The log is one of your features. It should be treated like that. So you should decide. I cannot give the golden rule to everyone. It might look like this. I mentioned the log should go in pairs. So the entry number 2 in the log is acting like ending for the first entry and the beginning for the following entries. So it's kind of optimizing the usage in pairs. But you might say that's too deep and it's pretty ugly code. Yeah, I agree. I don't like the code like that. You might say that's enough, and maybe you want to just have a bit shallower logging, or maybe you want to go aspect route and just mark something should be logged and you have some automated way, or maybe you just aggregate some stats based on doing something like that. Although I would then not call it logging, but logging with for stats or obtain the stats, measure stats, stuff like that. Or maybe you just don't want to do it at this level at all. Another thing that's pretty useful for this, because I mentioned to make the code more clear, I would avoid the top line and I would prefer the bottom line. Generate the code for your entities or like structures in the code. There are solutions for that, whether you're Java or .NET. You have a way to do it, and this is pretty okay-ish way to do this, that you just mark something that should generate the string methods, and then the logging is easier and more complete, because this is resistant to changing the variable name or adding a field or removing a field and so on, and you save so much work for yourself. Okay, let's dig into some of the other examples. So the largest scope that you can have in your application, and you can ask, okay, but we have to pair the logs, and let's say I claim this is valid log, and I do so. Why there are 3 lines? So I would say the printing of some configuration at the beginning is just, this is stating that something started. This is just a follow-up information. And it's a configuration that was when it started the process. So this is still paired. It's just that the beginning is evidenced across multiple lines. And what I would like you to do is, yeah, always evidence beginning and the end. Write stuff like environment, the version, the server, the configuration. You might intentionally change the configuration and restart on production. And how are you gonna evidence that you did the actual change, that it worked? Maybe your deployment process had some flaw, or maybe someone didn't press the button and stuff like that. You might believe something happened, but this way you have an evidence. So this is pretty useful in practice. What we used from what I propose. Yeah, we correlate to the server, to the instance, and running version of the code. And you should always know what runs on your production, otherwise you never know what's going on. So yeah, this is also a form of correlation. The in and out rule, log was paired, and I explained why. Okay. So moving on, the text itself in the logs. This is a pretty interesting topic, because on the internet, there's, I think, the most of the, to me, controversial advices is about this. To me, we use English only because some human being is going to read the logs. Otherwise, I would use some codes and avoid English at all, because it's easier to interpret by machine doing so. If you have automated monitoring, active monitoring solution in the system, it's gonna easier. It's gonna be easier for it to just pick up something that is not text necessarily. When the text that you put is self-explanatory, this is convenient. If a support person can understand that, do something and solve a problem in production, that's great. So I probably still use English. Otherwise, I would say these are not advices that you can give, and someone can read this and know what to do with the entry. You can try your best, and I think that would be the advice here, but I would like to focus on something more specific. So you want to avoid situations like on the left. This is pretty bad. You never know what it is. Maybe based on the results, you can identify which processing happened, but it's pretty time consuming. It's better upfront to know what happened. So you want to be on the right side. That I would recommend put the logs in the algorithmic section. We will discuss that in a moment, but it's just for the sake of an example. So do not place something that is the same multiple places in the code. Here, this log doesn't look too bad, the highlighted sections, right? It's just there, it's just text. Yeah, if we know the program, we know what it all means. But you might have numerous problems here. So you might have multiple batch jobs. And it's not evidence here what type of the batch job is here. It's just a batch job. Maybe that's good enough, and later entries will help tell you what happened. I would give more context here. Also, this reading of file at the end of the line started is kind of difficult to handle. So what I mean by that, make sure every time you log something in the code, make sure this is printing something unique into the log. So you can check the code for specific entry based on the logs, and vice versa, check the log based on knowing the code. And also the search term, the unique part of it, should be something that is in one place in the log, maybe at the beginning of the entry, and then a lot of data that you can attach should be on the right side. Something like that. A systematic approach to this would definitely help. So you know how to read that. Because what it does, it uniquely correlates to the line of the code. So the log is correlated, right? You really know what's going on. So that's why I say logs should always be correlated. And it's definitive correlation. I don't want something that is ambiguous. Okay, so let's fix that. So we added some additional information to our broken log. Okay, doesn't look too suspicious, but we added the CSV delta in many places. And you know, if you have some sort of, let's say, strategic pattern going on here, and this can be replaced with various other texts, maybe we talk about something different, and maybe the unique part is, again, something different, and we can just add a variable at the end that says what the method of processing is. So if you have any library or something that's reusable, you provide additional explicit context for it. It's something that you just attach as a piece of information when you correlate to what's the specific use case query, what's your intent here. And this way you can, you know, indicate for yourself. Again, this was just a variable part, and it's much easier to find out what's going on. You can search, you know, this variable context in your code easily, and the unique entries easily, and you know what's going on. If you consider that like a continuous text, obviously it's not something you can easily find in the code. Where that comes from, and why I'm really focusing on something like that, you know, I on daily basis, I'm involved in 4 applications where I have to look into the logs, and I'm not necessarily always know everything about these apps. So do your support. So if they just give you this just some of the information, or maybe like a new developer comes into your team, right? And then this is where it's also useful. Okay. Yeah, let's move on. So when that's useful, when we do a database query, when we do you know, file loading, you know, some HTTP call, you can provide what's the use case. Even if you log what's the endpoint on the HTTP call, but you may say what's the feature. Okay, and this is another classic. I mean, I've seen this so many times in almost every system. When you get exception, you just log it. Job done, right? That's mostly cool, but I see that many problems here in the log. Okay, so if you log an exception, it's a handled exception. Do not retrrow that. I mean, then on top level, you're gonna log that again. So why doing it twice? If you really want to do something, you know, maybe you should wrap that into your own exceptions, more elegant way. So let's fix that by removing this throw. We just learned that when we do database query, maybe we should provide a context. So let's provide a context. This is how it looks like. So and also like logging SQL might leak sensitive information. You know, you never know what's there. Maybe usernames and passwords are also included because, you know, something was neglected in your system from security standpoint. So yeah, I wouldn't do that. But still there are problems. So what I see here is just you know, failure in execution is logged. What I'm asking you to do is log successful and erroneous paths. Know your system, how it works on your regular basis. So I had many questions like that. You know, the query took 1 minute, and I've been analyzing this over time. You know, yeah, but it works like this for 2 years. Why today it's a problem for you, my dear user? So it brings you different perspective when you know your system. And I have another example for that. So what we are missing here is kind of a smell. We are missing that the logs are not paired. So I'll show in a moment how to fix the code. But look at another example. So imagine you get a timeout exception on your reading from the database after 1 minute, and you don't know what's going on. But if usually your query takes 1 second, like pointed out here on screen, you know that probably database is locked because of some other transaction, or maybe TempDB is full and you use that, and so on and so on. On the other hand, if usually your query takes almost a minute, it's on this, on the edge of this timeout, you might suspect it's a poor performance, or maybe at this point in time, like late hours and more batch jobs running, the database is loaded. So it immediately gives you a different perspective, and you can immediately look for something else. Yeah? So this is pretty interesting. So how we fix the code? This is how we fix the code. Okay, and we are smart, and I told you, we should correlate that. So okay, let's attach the correlation here. Yeah, so every single operation we can made up this because we leave our system. So, but yeah, I also said the logs should be in pairs, and here there are 3 lines. Okay, I also have a solution for that. So the green line shows you the positive path, the successful one. You will never get into a situation where you should, print 3 lines. So yeah, the red one connects just the pair that is when the error happens. Okay, log levels. When I first did this presentation, I've been asked about it. Why I skipped log levels? I mean, people write lengthy articles about log levels, right? I would say don't filter anything from your own logs. Because if you skip your one debug entry, that may answer why your application failed on production. I work for the bank. If we lose $1 million, I would be explaining this for months why my application crashed. So, yeah, you cannot go back into the past and rerun things in the same circumstances and maybe get the answer, right? So, yeah, it's still good to apply logs as per their role. Someone may mix this up, how to interpret that, and this way may lead to a situation where you skip this log. On the other hand, for libraries and drivers and etc., it's pretty useful to use the log levels for filtering. So I can recommend that. You don't want clutter on your MongoDB or any other subsystem. If you just use it for health checks, for example, and you use this information anyway on a real time. So yeah, it is a tool nonetheless. Okay, I promised that the algorithmic code will be discussed. So we should know by now there are some smells here going on. So let's move it to the right. So I'd say algorithmic code should contain no logs. Logging here may lead to logging again on upper layer. So like with the exceptions. Something that uses the algorithm, it gets the results. Maybe they should be doing the logging. Maybe they shouldn't do the logging because, wrong results or results at all, whether they are good or bad, they should have a different functional place. So logs shouldn't care at all about it. It's more technical log that we discuss. If you try to debug things, we have testing in 2021 that's intended to prove how your application works. So that should just evidence informative information, informative things, evidence something. And also, if you go too deep, you might place log on a hot path, which might be a bad idea unless that's your business, but there are very specific cases. So I would avoid logs on hot path. Okay. We also violated our logs going in pairs. So this is something that I would avoid and use this somewhat as a tool. Whenever you see a single entry, you should think about, okay, this is something which should wrap around. Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into one of the examples. So first, I will show something that is single-threaded. This is anonymized log that we have in our system. And when you do a search by, let's say, for this particular financial instrument, because that's for the bank, as I mentioned, something was going on. Yeah. If you just narrow to these lines, you can see we applied most of the concepts we discussed. So we have this coincidential correlation based of this instrument ID. We have that something came into the system, this instrument received. We know that it's somewhat ended below. This log and this log excerpt doesn't contain the second entry, but this real system made many years ago before I made this presentation. In the middle, you have some middle steps, which also follow, logging everything they've got about what they do. So they request something from another subsystem, and they successfully do so, and they get back the information, and they explain exactly step by step what they do, and so on. But anyway, you see the full history, even if your log is not perfect. And this is also something that I wanted to say. I'm not asking you to make everything perfect, but this is your way to improve things. You can do it by feature when you do the new things. It doesn't have to be, that you have refactor the entire system because you see in the presentation. But hopefully you will take something useful out of it. Okay, last point of advice that I want to mention is in terms of microservices. This is really trendy topic nowadays, right? Everyone is doing microservices. So what we do in another system that I'm working on is that we use explicit ID to track a single unit of work across our system, and I encourage you to do so. And also you can extend that into third party if they support that. So what you can do is to attach this explicit ID into your unit of work, make that persistent part of your business, expose that in the system so you can work with that. And you can log it in every microservice that you use, pass it in the headers that go outside if you intend to interconnect the activity. If you have multiple teams, make sure each team understands the concept. And this is invaluable for debugging. And the reason for that is you might use other business things, timings, to try to correlate that, you've sent a request to another service. But this service might log yourself a minute later because it was queued on a network layer in the system because of some slowness of the service and other tricks that might be played on you, or maybe the logging is not perfect on the other end. Or maybe you've sent 100 requests and one of them failed, but it really caused a problem in your system. How are you going to distinguish that on the other end? It probably might look the same on the other end. Various things can happen. If you attach something that is explicit ID, you can distinguish every single request sent. And that's just it's shortening the communication to an extreme, and sometimes just allows functionally to achieve asking question, getting the response. So the last example is this. This is just like a very short, very simplified graph of multiple service system using message queue in the beginning, use RabbitMQ. And I'm going to show how the log looks like between these services, what is the flow here, and the difference in this log when we search using our ID is that on the left side, I just to be able to show you this on the screen, I just show what's the service on the left side. And what's going on here, and we can discuss a few things going on here, is that this green highlight, you can use search by something from your business, okay? Because this is a business ID, something in your domain. So you search by that. This way you can find out your request ID, then search by this request ID and get more history from your log. If, as I mentioned, you expose your request ID related to your unit of work somewhere, the UI on the support page, or maybe, like everywhere, you can search upfront by this and know that this unit of work relates to something that is in your domain. What's more interesting is that you have a full story here, across various systems. And this is printed in time this way, how it went through all the services. Debugging distributed systems is pretty difficult, so having such evidence make your life much easier. Okay, there are other correlation IDs going on here. So this RabbitMQ, how we do it, we follow this log go in pair rule. And when we send something into the queue, we print that and we serialize the message we send. But we don't do it when the message goes back. So we just use an explicit correlation ID with everything sent. So we know in the log, we want to check something that is just relating to particular sending a message via RabbitMQ. So that's why on this search on page, you don't see evidence that, sent to the message queue, right? It's just strictly technical. Another thing that I would encourage, and I see the question on chat, by the way, about user input, but I will comment that in a second, is this. Here, the green highlights now show that we have a business object serialized, and later on a bit more. And when you can do something like this, it's pretty useful to literally print into the log what's serialized and what you send across the media, because sometimes these are very difficult serialization problems that you can come across, and how you can solve them if you cannot know what was sent. And also perspectives on both ends. You can see the lower audit received message that just that's the same message. It will show you that it was received. You never know which system perspective comes first when you try to debug things. So you should do it on both ends. So that's everything that I prepared. And I think we still have 3 minutes to discuss the questions. So I pointed out, be careful with putting user input. So, that's why I said, please log everything you can. Obviously, there are things you can't. This is something that is pretty important here. I mean, if you go public, right? If you go into internet, obviously you should control what you write into the log based on user input. If you work internally, like I do with organization where it's like within the company, there's like a family of, tens of thousands of systems. We print everything because we know, our users don't do malicious things. They might do it by mistake, but these are the things that we expect to happen. Sometimes we can accept, few things here and there, but usually it shouldn't happen that someone will hack us, okay? But definitely, logs and user input, this is a security concern and, these kind of things. Also, there is another questions about a lot of space, right? Okay, this question is mentioning audit purposes. So what we did in our systems, things that should permanently be stored for audit purposes, we called this audit feature, and you could actually see that here as an audit service. Called history on this graph, but this is like a different feature in my opinion. What we discuss here, the log is something that is more technical. You shouldn't really store this and believe, this is gonna evidence that you did your job well. So in my opinion, this is something that I would consider proper approach. Make that a proper feature instead. So it's not something I would do in a technical log. So okay. I don't see more questions in chat. So we are on time for a break. Thanks everyone for your time. And it was a pleasure to be on the conference. Thank you, everyone.